My name is Sander, and I'm a big fan of coffee, cocoa, and the climate. And since you're watching, I'm going to bet that you're too. When you're like us, you love thinking and talking about how we can produce all the products that we love so much while remaining within our planetary boundaries. This is the Carblecast. Let's dig in. Short while ago, I was talking to my father and he said, "Listen son, I've been following the videos that you post on YouTube and it all looks extremely nice and it's very well produced, but if I'm honest, I still don't understand what you're talking about." And I thought maybe it makes sense to do an episode in which we talk in much simpler terms, in layman terms, about everything we're doing and why we're so excited about it all. So that's this episode. I hope you enjoy. Our planet is around 4 billion years old. And for most of its life, the planet was a very inhospitable place for human life. The early Earth atmosphere contained no oxygen at all and was made up mainly of carbon dioxide, methane, sulfuric acids. But all of that changed when plants evolved. The plants harnessed the power of the sun to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They stored the carbon, so the C atom, made more biomass or more plants out of that, and they released the oxygen back into the atmosphere. The increase in atmospheric oxygen allowed for animals to evolve, including us humans. Since we inhale oxygen, the oxygen that we inhale reacts with carbon from our food, releasing energy. Actually releasing the energy that was once captured from the sunlight. And we exhale carbon dioxide. All of this was in a state of equilibrium for many millions of years until humans harnessed the power of fire. And we harnessed fire to burn woods, to clear lands, and of course to use wood as a fuel for cooking or for warming our homes. And this released a lot of carbon back into the atmosphere. And of course, this accelerated hugely when we discovered that we could dig up all this carbon that was stored deep underground, where it had formed oils and coals, that we could use as fossil fuels to burn at even much higher rates. But today specifically, of course, my interest is in deforestation and tree cover loss, a much bigger problem than I was aware of for very long. Deforestation results in 5 gigatons of carbon emissions every year. That's around 14% of our global carbon emissions. 5 times as much as the global aviation industry. Actually, if deforestation were a country, it would rank 3rd in terms of emissions, only behind China and the United States. But there is an alternative, which is regenerative agriculture. Giving as much back to the planet as what we extract from it. And the first time when I met regenerative agriculture was many years ago when I did my first field visit in Ethiopia. And I met a farmer who showed me his land. And I didn't understand what I was looking at. Because I had expected neat rows of coffee trees and instead I was looking at a forest. So I asked the farmer to explain himself. And he explained that this is how they've been farming for many generations already, under the shade of the natural forest canopy, without the use of any chemical inputs such as fertilizers or pesticides. And that this had all kind of benefits in terms of coffee quality, but also biodiversity, which played a big role in their traditional beliefs. And much later I discovered that it has this huge benefit in terms of carbon storage as well. Coffee agroforestry in its most extensive form, so basically in the form that looks most like a forest, can store the same amount of carbon as is stored in natural forest. And also in terms of biodiversity, we see the same species richness and the same types of species as we would encounter in natural forest. So clearly that these are all major positive impacts of agroforestry, but there is also a downside, and that's that the yields are lower. So the amount of kilograms of coffee or cocoa that a farmer can harvest from the farm is lower than what we would see with industrialized farming that's based on heavy input use. And this lower yield means that farmers in almost all coffee producing countries, with the possible exception of Brazil, do not earn enough to provide a decent standard of living for their families. And the result of this lower income is that farmers face continuous pressure to increase the yields of their farms, so to harvest more and more and more from the same plot of land. And to do this, they cut down shade trees. And this reduction in tree cover is one of the major components of the carbon impact of commodities like coffee and cocoa. That's how coffee and cocoa production impacts the climate. But what about the companies? What kind of problems do they face? In the coffee and cocoa industry, all major companies have committed to the Science Based Targets initiative. The Science Based Targets initiative provides a framework for companies to align their activities with our scientific understanding of climate change. So it allows companies to operate in a way that fits with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, which says we have to reduce our emissions with 50% by 2030 and reach planetary net zero by 2050. Well, for companies that are on this journey towards net zero, the first thing they do is calculate their current emissions. And that's when they discover that roughly 70% of these emissions actually take place at the farm level from deforestation and tree cover loss. Clearly, that's the biggest impact that they can have on their journey towards net zero. Besides this, there's a lot of regulation coming up, especially here in the European Union, that forces companies to take ownership of their impact. The biggest one here is the European Union's deforestation regulation, which requires all companies importing a range of commodities, including coffee and cocoa, but also soy, beef, rubber, etc., to provide evidence that all of the farms that produce their commodities were free of deforestation after the cutoff year of 2020. So it's not allowed to purchase commodities anymore from farms that were recently deforested. Now, what do we as a company do to help these companies? First of all, we help them measure their current and historic emissions from deforestation and tree cover loss. We use satellite imagery for that, which allows us to look back 20 years in time. Even if we only receive the farm GPS locations today, we can still see what happened 20 years ago, because the satellite imagery is always stored, it's always available. Then secondly, we help them model opportunities for reducing emissions in the future, as well as identifying where are there risks of emissions in our supply chain. For example, are there farms in my supply chain that still have a lot of tree cover, but that are located in areas with very high tree cover loss rates? Or can we model that, or can we calculate that it's economically not feasible for farmers to operate these farms with high tree cover currently, without any cash incentives to protect these tree covers? And then finally, we help companies mitigate emissions, so prevent emissions from tree cover loss, by offering farmers cash payments for not cutting down trees. And all at the same time, we provide the continuous monitoring that companies need for compliance with the European Union's deforestation regulation. Anyway, that was in a nutshell why we do the work we do and how we do it. And I hope that is a lot more clear than the very technical deep dives that we did in the previous episodes. This was the Carblecast. You can find us at carble.co or follow us on LinkedIn. And of course, I would love to hear your thoughts as well.